President Harry S. Truman is handed a short report. No cameras, no press, no announcement. Inside it are comments made by America's most famous general. General George S. Patton believes the United States has made a catastrophic mistake. The war, he says, ended too early, and with the wrong enemy left standing. Patton does not say this publicly. He says it privately, and that is what makes it dangerous. Truman does not dismiss Patton. He does not insult him. He does not fire him. Instead, Truman grows quiet, because Truman understands something the public does not. Europe in late 1945 is a powder keg, and Patton, brilliant, fearless, uncontrollable, might light the match. What Truman really thought of Patton was not hatred, it was fear, and within days, everything would change.
When Harry Truman became president in April 1945, he inherited not only a world war, but its most dangerous personalities. George S. Patton was one of them. Truman knew Patton's reputation well. North Africa, Sicily, France, the lightning dash across Europe. Patton was the general who broke stalemates, terrified enemies, and ignored political boundaries. Privately, Truman admired him. He later called Patton one of our greatest fighting generals. But Truman was not a battlefield president. He was a political survivor, shaped by Congress, alliances, and fragile coalitions. Patton spoke like wars were won by force alone. Truman knew wars were ended by diplomacy. From the beginning, their relationship was not hostile. It was incompatible. And in post-war Europe, incompatibility could start another war.
By the summer of 1945, Patton was no longer fighting Germans. He was governing them. As military governor of Bavaria, Patton faced a devastated land and an advancing Soviet presence. It was here that Patton said the words that sealed his fate. He openly warned that Stalin was no different from Hitler, that the Soviet Union was not an ally, but the next enemy, and that history would judge America harshly for trusting them. These were not drunken rants. They were consistent, documented statements made to journalists, officers, and in private letters. To Patton, the war had paused at the wrong moment. To Truman, those words threatened everything: Allied unity, European stability, and the fragile hope of peace. Patton was right about the danger, but timing, Truman believed, was everything.
Truman never publicly condemned Patton. Instead, memos circulated quietly. Journalists were redirected. Command structures were adjusted. In September 1945, Patton was relieved of his governorship. Officially, it was administrative. Unofficially, it was final. Truman later admitted the decision caused him pain. Patton was too valuable to lose, yet too dangerous to unleash. The president was not silencing a madman. He was restraining a man who might be right too early. 2 months later, on December 9, 1945, Patton died after a car accident in Germany. Truman was shaken. He ordered full honors, and privately said America had lost a warrior it did not know how to handle. The conflict never reached the public, but its consequences shaped the Cold War that followed.
After Patton's removal, the press focused on his indiscipline, but inside the Truman administration, the concern was far deeper. Patton had suggested something unthinkable in 1945, that former German soldiers, carefully screened, might one day be needed against the Soviets. To the public, this sounded like madness. To Washington, it was a diplomatic nightmare. The United States was still negotiating borders, reparations, and occupation zones. Any hint of rearming Germany could fracture the alliance overnight. Truman understood the contradiction. Even as American intelligence quietly studied the Soviet threat, the president knew Europe could not survive another shock. Patton had spoken a future truth, but in a present moment too fragile to absorb it.
While Patton spoke openly, Truman fought quietly. In late 1945, the president approved intelligence assessments that warned of Soviet expansion across Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, falling not by tanks but by control. Truman did not dismiss Patton's warnings, he absorbed them. But Truman believed wars were prevented by patience, not provocation. He authorized occupation stability, food relief, and reconstruction, knowing hunger created extremism. He avoided public confrontation with Stalin while preparing privately for containment. To the public, Truman seemed cautious. To history, he was laying the foundation of the Cold War. Patton wanted action. Truman wanted time. And time, Truman believed, was the only weapon that wouldn't destroy Europe again.
Truman faced another reality Patton never did: public opinion. Patton's earlier controversies still echoed. His remarks comparing Nazis to political parties, his refusal to fully purge former officials from local governments. Defending Patton would have meant defending everything he said. Truman chose the presidency over the general. Privately, he acknowledged Patton's strategic mind. Publicly, he allowed the narrative of recklessness to stand. This was not betrayal, it was containment. Truman believed that unchecked genius could be as dangerous as incompetence. Patton did not fall from disgrace. He was quietly set aside because no one knew how to use him without risking catastrophe.
On December 9, 1945, near Mannheim, Germany, Patton's staff car collided with a U.S. Army truck. He was paralyzed. 12 days later, he was dead. The debate ended instantly. Truman ordered full honors. There was no relief, only regret. The president later remarked that Patton had been a great soldier, but one who lived in a world that no longer existed. Yet within months, Truman would adopt policies that echoed Patton's fears: Soviet containment, military readiness, a divided Europe. Patton never lived to see it, but the war he warned about had already begun, without him. After Patton's death, his words stopped making headlines, but they did not disappear. Inside the Pentagon, officers who once dismissed him began quietly revisiting his assessments of Soviet intentions. Not his tone, his logic. Reports from Eastern Europe confirmed what Patton had feared: political purges, controlled elections, permanent occupation disguised as liberation. Truman never credited Patton publicly, but his administration began shifting language from cooperation to caution. Patton's mistake was not his analysis, it was his visibility. In Washington, dangerous ideas were not destroyed. They were buried, refined, and eventually reintroduced without the man who first voiced them.
By early 1946, Soviet actions removed all remaining ambiguity. Churchill would later call it the Iron Curtain. Truman had already seen the evidence. American observers were blocked from Poland. Opposition leaders vanished. Governments loyal to Moscow replaced those elected by their people. This was not Patton's war of tanks and columns. It was a war of control. Truman understood now that peace had been temporary. The president did not regret restraining Patton. He regretted that Patton had been right so soon. History would remember Truman as cautious, but caution had limits, and those limits were rapidly closing.
On March 5, 1946, Winston Churchill stood in Fulton, Missouri, with Truman seated behind him. When Churchill spoke of an Iron Curtain, he said publicly what Patton had said privately. Truman did not interrupt. He did not object. He allowed the moment to stand. This was no accident. The general had been too blunt. The statesman was precise. What Patton lacked in diplomacy, Churchill supplied in language. What Patton warned of in anger, Truman now prepared for in policy. The message had changed messengers, but not meaning. In 1947, Truman made the shift official. The Truman Doctrine pledged support to nations resisting communism. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe, not out of charity, but strategy. These were not Patton's tools, but they served Patton's objective. Containment replaced confrontation. Economics replaced tanks. Truman had found a way to fight the war Patton foresaw without starting the war Patton feared. Patton never saw it, but his worldview shaped it, not by force, by restraint.
Decades later, historians would revisit Patton, not as a reckless relic, but as a man trapped between wars. Patton understood dictators. He had spent his life studying them. Truman understood systems. He had spent his life navigating them. One saw the enemy clearly. The other saw the consequences. They were not opposites. They were incomplete without each other. And together, though never publicly aligned, they shaped the world that followed.
With time, a myth took hold that Patton had been silenced because he was inconvenient. The reality was more complex. Truman did not suppress Patton's ideas. He separated them from the man. Patton's temperament made him impossible to manage in peacetime Europe. But his strategic instinct was studied, recorded, and quietly preserved. The president was not afraid of Patton's conclusions. He was afraid of the reaction they would provoke. In 1945, the difference mattered. Truman believed the world could survive bad information. It could not survive panic.
Defending Patton publicly would have meant endorsing everything he said and everything he might say next. Truman understood Patton's power over public imagination. The general did not inspire debate. He inspired loyalty. At a moment when Europe needed calm, Patton generated certainty, and certainty can be dangerous. Truman chose ambiguity. He allowed Patton to fade rather than confront him, not because Patton was wrong, but because he was unstoppable. This was not cowardice. It was governance. George Patton was not built for peace. His genius emerged in movement, pressure, and decision. Occupation demanded compromise, patience, and restraint. Patton struggled with that world. He saw former enemies becoming administrators, former allies becoming rivals, victory dissolving into negotiation. To Patton, this felt like surrender. Truman understood the cost of victory better than Patton did, because Truman had to pay it. Patton won wars. Truman had to prevent the next one.
By the early 1950s, the world Patton warned about had fully emerged. The Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe. Germany was divided. NATO formed. Truman's policies held. Patton's fears proved accurate. History did not choose sides between them. It combined them. The United States confronted the Soviet threat, but without igniting another world war. What Patton demanded immediately, Truman achieved gradually. Harry Truman never called Patton a liability. He called him a great general. But Truman also believed greatness without control could be catastrophic. What Truman really thought of Patton was not anger or distrust. It was regret. Regret that the man who won battles could not survive the peace that followed. Regret that truth spoken too early becomes dangerous. Regret that leadership sometimes means saying nothing. Patton did not lose Truman's respect. He lost his moment in history. And that, more than any order or decision, is why it ended everything.
There was one thing history never recorded. No private meeting, no closed-door argument, no final conversation between Harry Truman and George Patton. Patton never sat across from the president and explained his fears, without journalists, without audiences, without consequences. Truman never had the chance to hear Patton, stripped of performance and provocation. Both men spoke, but never directly to each other. The absence of that conversation mattered, because this was not a clash of enemies, but of timing, language, and responsibility. The war had taught Patton how to defeat men. It taught Truman how to restrain nations. Between those lessons, history found no room for compromise.
Even today, Patton divides opinion. Veterans remember liberation. Families remember survival. Historians debate tone, judgment, and consequence. Some say Patton should have been promoted. Others say he was unfit for peace. Both are true. Patton represented certainty in a world that needed caution. Truman represented restraint in a world demanding strength. History rarely rewards balance in the moment. It recognizes it later. The argument was never about who was right. It was about when the truth could be spoken without destroying what remained.
What ended everything was not Patton's words. It was the moment they collided with responsibility. Truman did not stop believing Patton. He stopped allowing him to speak. The general who won wars could not shape the peace because peace required silence, patience, and compromise. Patton's career ended not in disgrace, but in irrelevance to the world that followed. And yet the Cold War unfolded along the very lines he predicted. Truman preserved the peace. Patton foresaw the threat. History needed both men. It just could not use them at the same time. That is what Harry Truman really thought of George Patton. And that is why it ended everything.